The chamber was old. Older than most civilizations still alive in the galaxy. Its walls were made of a dark stone that no longer existed on any planet, quarried from a world that had burned out 60,000 years ago. The beings who sat inside it had watched stars be born and die. They had seen species rise from mud and reach the sky. They had also watched many of those same species tear themselves apart, or worse, tear others apart on their way up. The Galactic Conclave had 47 members. Each one represented a civilization that had proven, over centuries, that it could be trusted with the stars. Some of them were tall, some were small. Some had no physical body at all, and existed as fields of organized light that floated above their designated seats. But all of them, in their own way, were ancient. And all of them, in their own way, were tired of being surprised by dangerous things. Today, there was a case on the floor. It had been building for a long time. The case was about a small, wet planet in an unremarkable spiral galaxy. Third rock from a medium-sized yellow star. The planet had no formal name in the Conclave's records. It was listed only by its star's catalog number, and a simple classification tag that had been updated 4 times in the last 300 years. The current tag read, Class 7 Volatile, Escalating. An attendant, a thin, gray-skinned being from the Mura Collective, stood at the center of the chamber and read from a long data scroll. His voice was flat and careful, the way voices get when the information being delivered is very serious and the speaker does not want any emotion to get in the way of it. He told them that the planet had approximately 8 billion inhabitants, all of the same species, who called themselves humans. He told them that these humans had, in the last 200 years alone, invented powered flight, nuclear weapons, global communication networks, genetic editing tools, and were now actively building machines capable of leaving their own solar system. He told them that in that same period, these humans had also fought 2 wars so large they called them world wars, had nearly destroyed their own atmosphere, had wiped out thousands of other species on their planet without much concern, and had come within minutes of launching enough nuclear weapons to end all complex life on their surface. Not once, but several times. He paused there. He let that last part sit in the air of the chamber for a moment. Then he presented the projection models. The Conclave's analytical division had run the numbers 41 times, using different variables each time. The results barely changed. If humanity continued on its current path, and the models showed an overwhelming likelihood that it would achieve deep space travel capability within 150 years. It would make first contact with at least 3 neighboring civilizations within 250 years. And based on its behavioral record, there was a 94.7% chance that at least one of those contacts would result in a conflict. A real one. Not a skirmish. The kind of conflict that ended civilizations. The attendant rolled up the scroll and stepped back. The chamber was quiet for a long time. Then the debate began. It was not a passionate debate. There were no raised voices. The beings in that chamber had seen too much for passion. It was a slow, careful, exhausted debate. The kind that happens when everyone in the room already knows what the answer is going to be, but feels the weight of it too much to rush toward it. Several members spoke about precedent. The Conclave had faced situations like this before. 11 times to be exact. 11 species had been flagged at Class 7 or above, and had gone on to be classified as Tier 1 extinction threats before action was taken. In 9 of those cases, the Conclave had waited too long, hoping the species would stabilize on its own. In 9 of those cases, other civilizations had suffered for it. The remaining 2 had been handled early. Those 2 were the only ones that no one in the chamber felt guilty about. A member from the Dovat sovereignty, a broad, heavy creature with 4 arms and a slow, deliberate way of speaking, said that humanity was not unique, that its pattern was well documented and well understood. That sentiment was not a valid reason to delay sound policy. Another member from the Yisan Trade Alliance agreed. He added that the planet was not particularly resource-rich, and that its location, while not ideal, was far enough from major trade corridors that the operation would draw little attention. The operation. That was the word they used. A sterilization fleet. 14 warships, each one large enough to be mistaken for a small moon, would be dispatched to the system. When they arrived, they would position themselves in high orbit and execute a surface-level atmospheric ignition protocol. It would be fast. The planet's surface would be rendered uninhabitable within 72 hours. The planet itself would survive. The rock would remain. The oceans would remain. But everything living on it would not. The vote was called. 46 hands, lights, signals, and acknowledgments went up. One did not. Ambassador Vayala of the Ren Collective sat very still in her seat. She was a small being, even by Ren standards. Her skin was pale green, and her large eyes were dark and very steady. The Ren were known across the conclave as pacifists, not naive ones, but the principled kind, the kind that had earned their pacifism through hard history and kept it through harder discipline. She had sat in this chamber for 60 years. She had cast difficult votes before. But not this one. She said quietly but clearly that the conclave was making a decision based on what humanity might become, not what it was. She said that no species in the archive had ever been evaluated on potential alone. She said that humanity had not been warned, had not been contacted, had not been given any opportunity to demonstrate whether it could choose a different direction. She said that destroying a species for a future crime it had not yet committed was not policy. It was fear dressed up in mathematics. The chamber did not respond with anger. It responded with the far colder thing, patience. Several members reminded her, gently, that this was not the first time these arguments had been made, and that the historical record did not support optimism in cases like this. The models were clear. The precedents were clear. The conclave was not acting out of cruelty. It was acting out of responsibility. Her objection was noted. It was logged into the official record. It was then, in every practical sense, set aside. The vote stood, 46-1. The fleet was to be assembled and dispatched within 1 galactic month. Travel time to the target system was estimated at 38 Earth years. The operation would be completed before the planet's inhabitants had any realistic chance of knowing what was coming, let alone resisting it. The chamber moved on to other business. Ambassador Vayala sat quietly for a long time after the session ended. The other delegates filed out around her. The lights in the chamber dimmed slowly, the way they always did when the day's work was done. She did not move. She stared at the empty center of the room, where the attendant had stood and read out the numbers. 94.7%, 11 precedents, 72 hours. She thought about a small, wet planet that had no idea it had just been sentenced to death. She thought about that for a very long time. And then, slowly, she began to think about what she could do about it. The antenna array on the dark side of the moon had been built to listen. That was its only job. It sat in the permanent shadow of the lunar surface, facing deep space, completely silent, completely still, catching radio waves and electromagnetic signals the way a net catches fish, patiently, without expectation, pulling in whatever the universe chose to send. Most of what it received was noise, cosmic static, the leftover hum of ancient stellar events, sometimes a pulsar's regular beat, sometimes the faint, unreadable echoes of radio waves that had been traveling for millions of years and arrived too broken to mean anything. The scientists who monitored the array had a saying among themselves: listening to the universe is mostly just learning how loud silence can be. Then, 12 years after the conclave's vote, something different arrived. It came in on a narrow frequency band that no natural source would ever use. In fact, it was almost too quiet to catch. A deliberate thing, carefully aimed, like a letter slipped under a door rather than shouted through it. The array's automated systems flagged it at 3:17 in the morning, station time. An alert was sent to the duty officer, who looked at it, did not understand it, and forwarded it immediately to the division head. The division head was Dr. Amara Solis. She was a small woman with short hair and the specific kind of tired eyes that come not from lack of sleep, but from too many years of caring very deeply about something most people found boring. She had spent 19 years in the Interstellar Communications Division, a quiet corner of the United Nations science apparatus that was mostly known for receiving no interesting communications at all. She believed, with the steady, unshakable belief of someone who has thought about something for a very long time, that the universe was not empty, and that eventually it would prove her right. When she read the first flag report, she did not feel excitement. She felt something calmer and more serious than that. She felt the particular stillness of a person who has been waiting for something and suddenly realizes it has arrived. She drove to the facility in the dark and did not tell anyone where she was going. The signal was built on mathematics, not complex, exotic mathematics, the universal kind. Prime numbers in sequence, the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter, the mathematical constant that described natural growth. These were numbers that any species capable of receiving the signal would recognize, because they were true everywhere in the universe and always had been. They were the closest thing existence had to a shared language. Embedded inside those mathematical foundations, layered beneath them, like text hidden inside a painting, was information. A lot of it. Compressed, structured, and encoded in a way that was clearly designed to be decoded by a species smart enough to notice the signal in the first place. It was a puzzle that said, if you can read this far, you can read the rest. Dr. Solis worked on it for 19 days. She slept in the facility. She ate at her desk. She brought in 2 colleagues she trusted completely, swore them to silence with a gravity that left no room for questions, and the 3 of them worked in shifts around the clock until the structure of the encoding cracked open and the contents came through. What they read took the warmth out of the room. The information was precise and organized. It described an interstellar governing body. It described that body's decision-making process. It described a vote, the date, the count, the margin. It described a fleet. It described what that fleet was built to do, and it described, with the kind of cold accuracy that made it impossible to dismiss as fiction, exactly how long Earth had before that fleet arrived. 26 years. Dr. Solis sat with that number for a long time. She turned it over in her mind, the way you turn over a stone, looking at it from every angle, hoping one angle makes it look smaller. It did not get smaller. 26 years was not very long. It was, in human terms, roughly 1 generation. It was enough time to raise a child and watch them become an adult. It was not very much time to prepare a planet for a fight with 14 warships operated by a civilization 80,000 years older than your own. But it was something. It was not nothing. She noticed one more thing in the signal before she closed the file. There was no name attached to it, no direct identification of the sender. But there was a small fragment of encoded data at the very end, almost like a signature, that contained coordinates pointing back toward a region of space the array had catalogued as inhabited. And alongside those coordinates was a single repeating mathematical phrase that, when translated into its logical meaning, came out as something very close to the words, "I am sorry they did not listen. I hope you do." Someone on the other side had taken a very large personal risk to send this message. Dr. Solis did not know who. She did not know why. But the message had been sent carefully, quietly, aimed precisely at the one place on Earth most likely to receive and understand it. That was not an accident. Someone had been watching. Someone had decided, alone, to do something about what they saw. She thought about that person for a moment. Then she put the thought aside. She had work to do. The summit was arranged within 3 weeks. It was listed on all official calendars as an emergency session of the Global Climate Infrastructure Council, a body so unremarkable that no journalist had ever written a meaningful story about it. 31 heads of state and their most trusted scientific advisors arrived in Geneva on a Tuesday morning. Security was the tightest it had ever been for an event that was officially about drainage systems and carbon sequestration. Dr. Solis stood at the front of the room and told them everything. She expected panic. She expected arguments, accusations, denials. She expected at least one person to stand up and call it a hoax. She had prepared responses for all of those things. She had barely slept in 3 weeks, and she was ready for a fight. What she got instead was silence. A long, deep, collective silence. The kind that falls over a room when every person in it receives the same enormous piece of information at the same moment. And each one privately runs through the same stages of disbelief, horror, and grim acceptance in fast forward. She watched it move across their faces like weather. And then, one by one, the faces settled, not into calm. Nothing about this was calm, but into something harder and quieter than panic. They settled into focus. The first question came from the defense minister of a mint-sized nation that had never been considered a major player in global politics. He was an older man with a gray beard and a direct way of speaking. He looked at Dr. Solis across the table and asked simply, "What do we need to do first?" That was the moment she knew they had a chance. Not a large one, not a comfortable one, but a chance. She opened the second folder on her desk and began to explain. Outside, the world went on as normal. People went to work. Children went to school. News channels argued about ordinary things. No one knew that in a quiet room in Geneva, the most important meeting in the history of the human species had just begun. And no one knew that somewhere in deep space, 14 warships were already moving, slow and certain, in the direction of the sun. 26 years is a long time to keep a secret. It is an even longer time to carry one. The people who knew, the 31 leaders, the handful of scientists, the small circle of military minds brought in during the first year, lived with the weight of it every single day. They woke up with it. They sat across dinner tables from their families with it. They gave speeches about infrastructure and trade policy and education reform, all while knowing that none of it would mean anything if the work being done in the background failed. Some of them aged quickly. A few could not carry it and quietly stepped away from the circle, placed under careful and permanent watch. Most of them stayed. Most of them found that the secret did not crush them. It focused them, the way a very cold morning focuses the mind, sharp, clear, no room for anything that doesn't matter. The work began in the first year and never stopped. The satellite network was the first priority. Earth already had hundreds of satellites in orbit. Communication relays, weather monitors, navigation systems. To anyone watching from the outside, the aggressive expansion program that began quietly in year 2 looked like a perfectly reasonable technological upgrade. More coverage, better resolution, faster data transfer. The scientists and engineers who built the new layer into the network knew what it really was. A grid, a layered electromagnetic barrier system that, when fully activated, could disrupt incoming signals, interfere with targeting systems, and in theory, only in theory, and they were honest with themselves about how thin that theory was, absorb or deflect a significant portion of directed energy weapons fire from orbit. It was not a wall. It was more like a very complicated, very expensive way of making Earth slightly harder to kill quickly. They called it the mesh, among themselves, in rooms with no recording devices. In year 4, a small group of physicists, working in a converted underground facility in Central Asia, began studying the fragments of alien technology described in Vayala's transmission. The transmission had not been a technical manual. It was never meant to be. But it contained enough structural detail about conclave propulsion and weapon systems to give a starting point. These physicists did not try to copy what they read. They were smart enough to know that copying a technology you do not fully understand is a fast way to build something that kills you instead of your enemy. Instead, they did what humans had always done with things they did not understand. They took them apart in their minds, piece by piece, and looked for the underlying principles. They found a few, but enough to make some adjustments to Earth's own developing technologies that would matter later. The Deep Space Fleet was built in the asteroid belt, far enough from Earth to avoid any detection from monitoring stations, close enough to be supplied without drawing attention. 7 ships. They were not beautiful. They were not elegant. They looked exactly like what they were, machines built by a species that had figured out the principles of deep space travel about 40 years ago, and was doing its absolute best with that limited head start. They were dense with redundant systems, packed with point defense weapons, and designed around a core philosophy that one of the lead engineers described simply as, "If we cannot outgun them, we will outsurvive them long enough to make them reconsider." The engineer's name was Commander Yusuf Okafor, and he was, without any formal announcement or ceremony, the person the Circle had agreed would lead whatever response Earth was able to mount. He had not been chosen because he was the most decorated soldier anyone could find, though his record was long and serious. He had been chosen because of a single quality, that the selection committee, a quiet group of 6 people who met in person only 3 times, had agreed was the most important thing a person in his position could have. He was comfortable with hard truths. He did not need things to be better than they were in order to function. He could look at a bad situation directly, without flinching and without false hope, and still find the next right step inside it. He had done the math on their odds many times. He kept the results in a small notebook that he never showed anyone. The numbers were not good. He prepared anyway, every day, with the same steady discipline he brought to everything, because he had long ago decided that odds were a description of the past, and preparation was a description of the future, and he was only interested in the future. In year 9, the education reform began. It was subtle enough that most people never noticed it for what it was. School curriculums around the world shifted slowly. More engineering, more physics, more emphasis on cooperative problem solving, more focus on systems thinking and adaptive reasoning. It was framed publicly as a response to economic demands, to technological job markets, to the need for a more scientifically literate population. All of those things were true. They were also cover. The children who moved through those reform systems grew up sharper, more collaborative, more capable of working across differences toward a shared goal than any generation before them. They did not know why they had been shaped this way. They were simply ready, in ways they could not name, for a world that would eventually need them to be. In year 17, long-range sensors picked up the first faint trace of the fleet. It was barely a signal, a gravitational disturbance at the very edge of the solar system's outer boundary. The kind of thing that could have been a passing rock formation or a minor anomaly in the data. But the analysts who looked at it knew what they were looking for. And what they were looking for was exactly this. They confirmed it 3 times over 6 months before bringing it to Commander Okafor. He looked at the data for a long time without speaking. Then he nodded once and said, "Move the timeline up by 2 years on the Outer Fleet Assembly. And tell Dr. Solis we need to talk about the transmission." The room went quiet at that last word. The transmission had been discussed before, in early planning meetings, as a theoretical option, one of many possible responses that had been listed and set aside. Most of the circle considered it too uncertain, too abstract, too dependent on the assumption that the beings approaching Earth were capable of something they had never, in 80,000 years of recorded history, demonstrated in a case like this. That assumption was large. It was uncomfortably large. It asked a great deal of faith in an enemy that had already voted to burn the planet without a second thought. But Okafor had never fully let it go. He had come back to it quietly, alone, over the years, turning it over in his mind, the way you turn over a stone you are not ready to put down yet. He had a feeling about it. Not the comfortable kind of feeling, but the specific, serious feeling of a person who has run out of better options, and has arrived at the one that frightens him most, because it might actually be right. The fleet was 11 months out now. The mesh was online. The 7 ships were in position. A generation of sharp young minds was ready, even if they did not know for what. Earth had done everything it could with its hands. Now came the part that could not be built, or measured, or tested in advance. Now came the part that depended entirely on whether two very different kinds of beings, separated by 80,000 years of history and 38 light-years of empty space, had even one important thing in common. Okafor sat at his desk late that night, long after everyone else had gone, and opened the small notebook with the bad numbers in it. He looked at them for a while. Then he closed it, set it aside, and began writing something entirely different. He was writing the transmission. 30 days out. That was the number on the screen when Commander Yusuf Okafor walked into the command center on the moon base and took his seat at the head of the long table. 30 days before the Conclave fleet would reach weapons range. 30 days before 14 warships, each one carrying enough firepower to crack the atmosphere of an entire planet, would be close enough to begin the end of everything. The room was full. Every senior officer, every lead scientist, every key member of the circle that had carried this secret for 26 years was present. They had all seen the number. Nobody spoke when he sat down. They just looked at him, the way people look at the one person in the room they have decided to trust with the thing they are most afraid of. Okafor looked back at them calmly. He put both hands flat on the table. "We are not firing first," he said. The room stayed quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then 3 people started talking at the same time. He let them speak. He listened to all of it. The tactical arguments, the probability calculations, the very reasonable point that the 7 ships in the asteroid belt represented 26 years of work and were the only real military option Earth had ever managed to build. He listened to the fear underneath all of those arguments, because that was what it really was, and fear deserved to be heard before it was answered. When they were done, he spoke again. He said that the ships would hold their positions. The mesh would stay active. Both were insurance, not the plan. The plan, the real plan, the one he had been writing and rewriting for the last 11 months, was the transmission. He pulled up the file on the main screen. It was enormous. Not in file size alone, though it was that too. It was enormous in scope. It contained humanity's full recorded history, everything that had ever been documented, archived, filmed, written down, or saved. Every war, every peace treaty signed the morning after, every scientific discovery, every court verdict, good and shameful, every famine and every harvest, every piece of music ever formally recorded, from ancient drums to modern orchestras, every painting that had been digitized, every book that had been converted to data, every speech by every leader, the inspiring ones and the terrible ones with equal honesty, every documented act of extraordinary cruelty, and alongside each one, without comment or excuse, every documented act of extraordinary kindness that humans had managed in the same dark centuries. It did not try to make humanity look good. That had been the hardest part to get right, and it had taken Okafor the longest to understand why it mattered so much. Any species capable of crossing 38 light-years to erase a planet was also capable of recognizing a lie, or a cleaned-up version of a truth. The moment the transmission tried to present humanity as better than it would lose everything. The Conclave had data. They had centuries of observation. They would see the gaps immediately. So there were no gaps. There was no flattering edit. A soldier carrying a wounded enemy off a battlefield sat in the file right next to the record of the war that had put them both there. A scientist who shared a life-saving medical formula with a nation his country was actively fighting appeared right alongside the political speech that had started the conflict. A man who had jumped into a frozen river to save a stranger's dog. An act so small and so impractical and so completely unnecessary that it had made Okafor pause when he first found it in the archive. Was given exactly the same weight as a moon landing. At the very end of the file was a short spoken message. 43 words. Dr. Solis had recorded it herself, in 12 languages, each one a major conclave tongue, identified from fragments of the original transmission. Her voice was steady. She did not sound frightened, though she was. She sounded like a person who had thought very carefully about what needed to be said, and had then said it as plainly as possible. We know what we are. We are not finished yet. Come see. Okafor looked around the table. We broadcast on all available frequencies simultaneously. Wide beam, aimed directly at the fleet's approach vector, but open enough that it carries in every direction. Anyone within 400 light-years with a receiver will pick this up. One of the senior officers leaned forward. She had been with the program since year 3, and had never once questioned an order. She questioned this one. She asked him, directly and without hostility, what he thought the chances were that it would work. He was quiet for a moment. He gave her the honest answer, which was that he did not know. He said that no species in the Conclave's history had ever done this. Not one of the 11 condemned species had ever responded this way. They had begged, they had attacked, they had gone silent. Not one of them had looked the Conclave directly in the eye and said, "Here is everything we are, all of it, the worst and the best together, now you decide." He said that was exactly why he believed it had a chance. The broadcast went out at 0400 hours, station time. The signal left Earth's moon in a perfect expanding sphere, carrying 8 billion lives worth of history in every direction at the speed of light, aimed most precisely at a point in space where 14 warships were moving slowly and with absolute certainty toward a planet they had already decided to erase. Inside the lead ship of the Conclave fleet, High Commander Drax of the Solveth Imperium was reviewing final approach calculations when his communications officer reported an incoming signal from the target planet. He did not look up immediately. Signals from condemned planets were not unusual. They were usually mathematical, attempts to prove intelligence, as if intelligence were the question. Sometimes they were emotional transmissions, raw audio and video with no structure. None of them had ever changed anything. He told his officer to put it on the secondary screen and flag anything unusual. 3 hours later, Drax had not moved from his seat. He had watched humans bury their dead with flowers. He had watched them draw pictures of things that did not exist. He had watched a small child, no older than 4, share food with another child who had none, completely unprompted, in the middle of a city that was at the same time hosting a war 2 kilometers away. He had read mathematical proofs left in open transmissions by scientists who were dead before the proof was ever answered. He had listened to music that had no apparent function, no tactical purpose, no survival value, music that seemed to exist only because the beings who made it needed to feel something and wanted others to feel it too. And he had watched, near the end of the file, a single piece of archive footage of a human man sitting in a small, quiet room, reading a letter from someone who had clearly hurt him very badly, and then writing back anyway. No explanation, no context given, just a man choosing, alone, to try again. Drax sat back in his chair. He had destroyed 11 worlds in his career. He had been proud of his precision, his efficiency, his lack of hesitation. He had believed, fully and without doubt, that what he did was necessary. He was the galaxy's caretaker. He removed dangerous things before dangerous things became catastrophic things. It was clean work, in the way that only very cold logic can be clean. He looked at the screen for a long time. Then he reached forward and pressed the button that signaled a full fleet stop. The 14 warships slowed. The approach vector held, but the speed fell away to nothing. They sat in space, 30 days out from a small wet planet, and they did not move. His second-in-command appeared at the doorway of his quarters. She looked at him with an expression that asked a question she did not yet know how to put into words. Drax looked back at the screen, where the 43 words were still displayed in 12 languages. "We know what we are. We are not finished yet. Come see. Get me a channel to the Conclave," he said quietly, "and tell them to watch everything before they respond." The Conclave chamber had seen many things in 80,000 years. It had seen empires dissolve in a single vote. It had seen species beg for membership and species beg for mercy. It had processed wars, treaties, disasters, and discoveries with the same steady ancient calm of an institution that had decided long ago that nothing in the universe was truly surprising anymore. Then the transmission arrived. Drax had forwarded everything, the entire file, unedited, with a single note attached in plain text that read, "Review before proceeding. I will accept judgment after." It was a short sentence for a very large act. By sending that note, he had formally acknowledged that he had halted a sanctioned operation on his own authority, without approval from any member of the Conclave leadership. In the Solveth Imperium, where Drax held his commission, it was the kind of decision that ended careers, and occasionally ended more than careers. He had sent it anyway. The Conclave spent 6 hours in closed session reviewing the transmission. Then they spent another 4 arguing about it. The chamber that had been so coldly united 4 decades ago was now fractured in a way that made several of the older members visibly uncomfortable, because they had not seen this chamber fractured in a very long time. Some members held firm. They said the transmission was irrelevant. They said that the species' behavioral record had not changed, that the probability models had not changed, and that one creative piece of communication did not cancel out centuries of documented volatility. They said that if the Conclave allowed sentiment to override analysis, it would set a precedent that could cost other civilizations their safety. Their arguments were organized and serious, and built on the same foundations that had produced the original vote. But something had changed, and the thing that had changed was not in the arguments. It was in the room itself. Because the transmission had not stayed inside the closed session. It had gone wide, broadcast openly across 400 light-years, picked up by civilian receivers on dozens of worlds, played in homes and public spaces and research stations across the Conclave's entire sphere of influence. By the time the chamber convened its second session, the transmission had been viewed by more beings than had ever paid attention to a Conclave proceeding in living memory. And the response to it was not uniform, and it was not quiet. On the Ren homeworld, public squares were filled with people watching the footage of a human child sharing food in a city at war. On the Yisan trade stations, merchants and philosophers were arguing, genuinely arguing, for the first time in decades, about whether the Conclave's extinction model had always had a flaw at its center. On 17 different worlds, beings who had grown up knowing the Conclave as the galaxy's steady and unchallengeable authority were asking, for the first time, what it meant to condemn a species for crimes it had not yet committed. Ambassador Vayala walked into the chamber for her tribunal and found an audience that was no longer entirely against her. She had been brought before the council to answer for the leak. The charge was serious: unauthorized transmission of classified deliberation records to a non-member species. There was no real question about whether she had done it. She had done it, and she did not pretend otherwise. She stood before the chamber with the same small, steady posture she had always carried, and she told them exactly why. She said that she had sat in this chamber for 60 years and watched the conclave make good decisions and hard decisions, and a few decisions it had never fully examined afterward. She said that the vote on humanity had been the one decision she could not add her silence to, because silence in that moment would have made her complicit in something she did not believe was right. She said she understood the value of protocol. She said she also understood that protocol was a tool, not a god, and that any institution that could no longer tell the difference between the two had stopped serving the purpose it was built for. Then she said one more thing. She said that she had not sent the transmission to save humanity. She had sent it to give humanity a chance to save itself. There was a difference, and the difference mattered, because everything that had followed, the preparation, the fleet, the 7 ships in the asteroid belt, the generation of children quietly raised to be more than the generation before them, the 43 words spoken by a small, tired woman on the surface of a moon, all of that had been humanity's own work. She had only opened a door. They had walked through it themselves. The chamber was very quiet when she finished. The vote on proceeding with the sterilization was called one final time. The count came in slowly, member by member, and when it was done, the number was different from the number 40 years ago. Not reversed entirely, there were still members who voted to proceed, who believed in the models and the precedents and the cold mathematics of prevention. But the majority had shifted. The motion to proceed failed. The chamber moved, after a long pause, to a secondary motion. Earth would not be welcomed into the conclave. That was not on the table, and no one was pretending it was. Humanity was still young, and still dangerous, and still carrying every quality that had earned it the Class 7 tag in the first place. But it would not be destroyed. It would be reclassified under a designation that had no real precedent in the conclave's taxonomy. The record would show it simply as this: Probationary Sovereign. Observe. Do not interfere. It was not a welcome. It was not an apology. It was the galaxy's oldest institution admitting, in the most careful and limited language it could manage, that it was not entirely sure what humanity was yet, and that perhaps it should find out before deciding. Veala's tribunal ended without a formal conviction. The charges were noted and suspended indefinitely pending a broader review of classified deliberation protocols. It was as close to vindication as the conclave knew how to offer, and she accepted it with the same quiet dignity she had brought to everything else. Drax was removed from his command of the sterilization fleet. He accepted that without protest. He was reassigned 18 months later to a diplomatic observation post, a position several ranks below what his record warranted. He accepted that too. He kept on the small desk in his new quarters a single printed image from the human transmission. It was the man in the quiet room, writing back. He never explained to anyone why he kept it. He did not feel the need to. On the moon base, Commander Okafor stood at the wide observation window and watched the running lights of the conclave fleet change direction. 14 warships, each one the size of a small city, each one carrying enough firepower to end everything he had ever known, slowly and wordlessly turning in the dark. No communication, no formal confirmation, just the lights moving away, steady and quiet, like ships leaving a harbor at night. He did not cheer. He did not feel what he had expected to feel, which he had always imagined would be relief. What he felt instead was something harder to name, a heavy, wide-open feeling, the kind that comes not at the end of something, but at the very beginning of something else, something so large you cannot yet see its edges. Dr. Solis stepped up beside him. She looked at the lights for a while, without speaking. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked. He watched the last of the lights fade into the dark between the stars. "Yes," he said, "so will we." Neither of them spoke after that for a long time. Below them, through the curve of the moon and the thin bright line of the Earth's atmosphere, 8 billion people went about their lives, eating, arguing, building, breaking things, fixing them, loving each other badly, and trying again. None of them knew how close it had come. None of them knew that the sky had almost ended. None of them knew that the reason they were still alive was a lone alien diplomat who had taken a risk no one asked her to take, and a generation of humans who had quietly gotten ready for something they were never told was coming, and 43 words spoken plainly into the dark by a tired woman who had decided that the truth, all of it, was the only thing worth sending. A new signal went out from the moon base at dawn. Not a desperate one this time, not a hidden one. It was open, clean, aimed in every direction at once. An introduction, freely given, from a species that had looked at itself honestly and decided that was enough to start with. The universe had marked Earth for extermination. Earth had transmitted instead, and for the first time in 80,000 years, the universe wrote back.